Hello there, welcome back to Nerdled Empire and continuing the Confederacy series. This episode on the man of legend, the man who conquered, the man who destroyed, General Jean-Luc Picard of the Star Corps of the Confederacy of Earth, or COE. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below your thoughts and comments on the Confederacy and on this tyrannical warlord we know and love. As we know, this was a divergent timeline created when an alien entity, almost godlike and omnipotent, known as Q, went back in time and changed a key event from human history in the early 21st century. He didn't just do it his normal way and click his fingers and blink existence into something different. He did it this way to give humanity a fighting chance to actually prove themselves once again, as the trial never ends. Now, the consequences of this event was, instead of going forth and creating a peaceful, homogeneous federation, they went forth and created a tyrannical, enslaving confederation. The symbolism is lost on no one, I think, but there are several things about the timeline that are interesting. We know very little about the early days of the Confederacy. We know a little bit about how it started. We know how it was in 2401, but the time in between is a little vague. We know that General Picard commanded the CSS Worldraiser. He may have commanded, probably did command, other vessels earlier in his career. This ship was a version, in that universe, of a Galaxy-class starship as best as we understand it. However, the question I have, we know that by this time the Confederation had destroyed or conquered the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and had managed to obliterate the Borg. Now we know the events where they take on probably the Ferengi, the Cardassians and the Borg were all done by Picard. He certainly was instrumental, certainly where the Borg and the Cardassians were concerned, as he fought in that universe's version of whatever the border wars were with Cardassians. We know that he went up against Gul Dukat, and Gul Dukat inflicted significant physical trauma upon him before eventually being killed and his head severed from his body, cleaned of its flesh, and becoming part of Picard's personal collection of his vanquished enemies, as was Grand Nagus Zek, indicating the Ferengi Alliance had also been subjugated and its leadership literally decapitated. Why exactly? Not sure, but after all, the Ferengi were quite hostile in the early days. The better question is, what was the Confederacy doing for years earlier? By 2401, they were in a current state of war with the Vulcans. Vulcan is a relatively close planet to Earth. With the sheer amount of firepower and xenophobia the humans had towards other species, how was it that Vulcan had survived for so long, especially with monsters like General Picard? It's a question I have. I do wonder if the Confederacy was more of a xenophobic power up until the late 24th century, perhaps, and then began to expand outwards, or perhaps what we saw with the Vulcans was merely some form of rebellion. It's not entirely clear. But on to General Picard himself proper. General Picard, as I said, was a high-ranking military officer within the Star Corps. He was very well respected and considered one of its greatest generals and leaders, and an inspiration to all generations, current and future, of the human race for his military exploits, strategies, and conquests of some of the most prodigious enemies of the human race, such as the Borg, most notably, bringing them to the point where all that remained of them was a single drone in the form of the Borg Queen. And I know she's a little more than a drone, but effectively she's still only a physical representation of the greater whole of the Borg. But that was all that was left. He'd already defeated the Cardassians. We know he'd at least been involved in that conflict if he hadn't led it. Perhaps General Sisko had done that if he was a general. That's a hypothetical. Who knows? We do know that they'd already defeated the Klingons and the Romulans. My guess would be earlier than this, allowing people like Picard to focus on greater enemies current, such as the Borg, the Cardassians, and maybe the Ferengi? But we know almost nothing about the military exploits other than the fact that he was considered a war hero and a great general, subjugating and destroying the Xenos scum and enemies of mankind. So he was rewarded in what was basically his semi-retirement. He goes back to his chateau in France and surrounds himself with his fallen enemies, and basks in the glory. He's now resided as something more of a training officer, staying at their academy and inspiring the troops and training next generations of soldiers, rather than necessarily being a frontline officer due to his advanced years. But he was well respected and was close to President Hansen, and we can assume to previous Confederate presidents as well, considered both an advisor, military leader, and confidant of various different regimes, would be my guess, which would be how he managed to keep himself in power. The masses as well, more outside of just the Star Corps. It's unusual for a military officer to gain such popularity amongst the civilian population. People knew his name, they cheered his name. They genuinely believed he had brought peace and stability and security for them. And he was the greatest recruitment tool of the late 24th and early 21st century that the Confederation had to get more men and women to enlist in the Star Corps and whatever other military organizations the Confederacy had, or any other adjacent industries. Regrettably, because we never actually got to meet General Picard, only a speech he made, which was repeated, which was a sort of a "your nation needs you" kind of speech. Uncle Picard needs you to fight the dirty, disgusting enemies of the human race. That kind of thing. We never actually get to meet him or see him in action, but we can assume, due to his success in such an oppressive and violent regime, he was an astute politician, he was physically capable, psychologically very, very well bred for war, and had no qualms about killing mass numbers of civilians, whether they be alien and probably even human. We can't assume the Confederacy was against turning on its own people when it had to. He was able to hold on to power and a high military rank long enough to retire. That says something about the man, not unlike Inab Brantain, who was the only leader of the Obsidian Order to ever retire, not simply be assassinated or executed. And I think we can put General Picard in a similar sort of vein to that individual, albeit not in the intelligence services, although thinking of it, I'd hate to see what the Confederates' version of Section 31 was like. Section 31 were bad enough. They're probably more like Room 5 or something. Anyway, that, as I said, is regrettably all that we know about this great war leader of the human race and the Confederacy of Earth. A man who trained many soldiers of the Confederacy, taught naval warfare, won many great battles, and led several campaigns against some of humanity's greatest enemies, with his most notable victory being that, in my opinion, against the Borg, as we see a reenactment of that, likely that major battle, of the CSS Worldraiser blasting its way through at least one Borg cube. So again, there we have it. This man, the myth, the legend that is General Picard. Now I just want to go on a slight tangent. I have a playlist as well if you're interested, because there's kind of a juxtaposition between this Confederacy and the Terran Empire. Which one is worse? I'd like to hear people's thoughts in the comments below. Now admittedly we know more about the Terran Empire, but we also know that the Terrans integrated non-humans into their navy, into their version of Starfleet. Although be it as second-class officers and citizens, they still did it. We know that the Vulcans, the Andorians and others were able to retain a certain degree of autonomy, indicating the Empire more controlled through proxy and fear than it did through necessarily direct rule unless absolutely necessary, because basically mind-wiping a conquered population and using them as slaves is useless, because if they don't have the intelligence to be useful citizens of the Empire, then what the hell, what's the point in having them conquered? You still need to have them as intelligent, free-thinking individuals as long as they behave, and that's kind of the way the Terran Empire worked. But I'm not sure the Confederacy saw it the same way, which again brings me back round to why the Vulcans were at war with the Confederacy. Were the Vulcans just able to hold out against them? Who knows? Put your comments in the comment section below.
I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others, and also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.